Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and I'm here today to talk to you about the cached property decorator. So, one convenient use of properties is when you need to run some code in order to set up the object you want, you can use a cached property decorator. For example, let's say we need to connect to a database, right, or an API. So, in both cases, you have to set up a client object that knows how to talk to a database or API in that case. It's pretty common to use a property, and in that case, so you can hide away the complexity of having to set up the client, and then you can just use it. So here's like a simple example. So let's make a class called client, and we're going to define init and self, and then we're just going to print setting up the client, like that. Okay, simplest client on the planet. Now let's define a query. So let's define a query and say self, and then let's take some keyword arguments, and then we will just print f, and then I will say performing a query. Boop, and then I will, in here, let's put our keyword arguments. So quargs, such a fun word to say. Okay, so now let's make a class called manager, and we'll use a property decorator at property, and we will say define client self, and then in here we are just going to return client. Okay, and then we'll also define perform query, because you have to perform the query, and we'll just say self and keyword arguments, and we will return the value of self.client.query and with the keyword args, like that. So in this code, we just made a dummy client class, which prints a string setting up the client. Doesn't do anything other than that. Every time we create a new instance. So every time somebody uses this to set up a client, it's going to say that. It also has a pretend query method here, which doesn't do anything. That prints a string as well. So then we have a class manager on line 7, which has a client property, which creates a new instance of client every time it's called. For example, to like call a perform query, right? To call this. So if we run this code, you'll notice that every time you call perform query on the manager, you'll get the string setting up the client, and it's printed in the console. But when creating a client is expensive, the code would be wasting resources, so it might be better to cache the client. So let's look at how this works now, and then we'll look at how we do cache properties. All right, so let's do Python cache, and it doesn't do anything because I didn't actually call anything. So let's try something. Well, because I'm not actually calling anything. So let me change the code and make this a little bit easier. So let's say we call, let's make a class called manual cache manager. Okay, and we will use a property decorator, property, and we will define client self and say if not has attribute, then self dot underscore client, self dot underscore client is just client. What did I do? Oh, I need to hit enter. What did I mess up? Oh, hi, how's it going? Boop. Little too aggressive with my tab. There we go. Yeah, and just client. And then if it is, then we'll just return self dot underscore client. Okay, so the manual cache manager is a little bit smarter. The client property first checks if the attribute client is on the class by calling the built-in has attribute function. So if it's not, it assigns underscore client to a new instance of client. And then it just returns it at the end. So repeatedly accessing client property on this class will only create one instance of client the first time. From the second call on, underscore client is returned with no need to create a new one. This is such a common need that in later versions of Python, functools module was added, and it or Func Tools module added the cache property decorator. And the beauty of using that is instead of the manual solution, um, is that in case you need to refresh the client, you can simply delete the client property, and the next time you call it, it'll recreate a brand new one for you. So let's look at an example of what that would look like. So I'm going to make a class. Well, actually, I would say from Func Tools import cached property, and then I would say I'm going to make a class called cached property manager, and I will use the cached property cached property decorator, and we'll say define client with self and just return client. Pretty simple, right? But then I'm going to define my perform query, right? So we can actually do the query self keyword arguments, and then just return self dot client. Oops, self dot client dot query on your keyword arguments, like that. Okay, let me put a line here so you can see the difference between them. Oops, undo, copy, go up, paste. All right, there. So now you got two different ones. So if we run this code, what do you think will happen? Probably nothing right now, right? So we actually need to start looking at calling this stuff. So let me comment out the beginning stuff. Actually, let's comment out the manual as well. So I just have this one little tiny thing right here. So in order to actually see this in action, let's do some stuff. So let's say manager is cached property manager. We'll just call that as it is. And then we'll say manager dot perform query, and then we'll take an object underscore ID equals 42. And then we'll say manager dot perform query name I like equals, and then we'll just grab percent Python percent, like that. Let's see, and then let's say delete the manager dot client, which causes a new client on the next call. And then we'll try it again and say manager perform query, and then we'll say age underscore GTE equals 18, something like that. So let's see what happens and how many bugs I have in my code. All right, so cache property, which I didn't spell correctly. All right, line 37, object ID is 42. This error, perform query, name client is not defined. Return client. Oh, because I have to actually build this somewhere else. I guess let's leave our class client. I don't know if I need manager. Did I call the manager? Yeah, I mean I did. So if I do this, it should solve that, and then we need to do the manager as well. So let's take a look. Okay, now we're good. Okay, so our output here is the first thing. It says setting up the client, which would be your new client, and then it performs a query, which would be your first query. Performs a query is your second query, and then there's another client that says setting up the client, and then it performs a query, which is your third query. It's only after you manually delete the manager.client that you get a new one when we invoke manager perform query again. So notice we didn't actually, like, just by calling this, it went ahead and set up the client. But it didn't do that on the next query. It wasn't until we deleted the manager client that it said, oh, I need to set up a client again, and it set up the client again. So that's one way to do it. Python 3.9 has a cache decorator, which you can use in conjunction with the property decorator to cover scenarios where the cache property is not suitable. But like I said in my last video, definitely read all the official Python documentation and just experiment with your particular use case. But this is essentially uh, the basics of the cache property decorator. So if you have any questions, let me know. And if not, then happy coding.